I don't really talk about this often, but every time winter rolls around, I can't help but think about that night. It happened when I was 22, fresh out of college and back in my small hometown in upstate New York. My parents had taken a trip to visit family down south, leaving me alone in the house for the first time in years. I thought it would be fun, just me, a cozy fire, and a few old movies to pass the time. I didn't know that night would change everything for me. The snowstorm started earlier than expected, and by sunset, it was a full-on blizzard. The winds howled outside, rattling the windows, and the snow piled up against the porch. It was the kind of night you don't want to be caught in. I had the fireplace going, my dog, Charlie, curled up at my feet, and a mug of hot chocolate in my hands. It should have been perfect, but something didn't feel right. It started with the sound, just a faint knock. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I remember laughing nervously. Who in their right mind would be out in weather like this? I figured it might have been a neighbor needing help, so I got up, wrapped myself in a blanket, and went to check. Charlie stood up too, his ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. That should have been my first warning. When I opened the door, no one was there, just the snow whipping around in the dark. I called out, "Hello, anyone there?" My voice seemed to disappear into the storm. Nothing. I shook it off, locked the door, and went back to the fire. Charlie didn't settle, though. He kept pacing and whining, his eyes fixed on the door. The knocks came again. This time they were louder, more urgent. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the fireplace poker and cautiously opened the door a second time. Again, no one. But this time there were footprints, fresh ones. They led from the driveway to my front porch and then stopped. There were no prints leading away, just a single set coming toward the house. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my heart racing. I called my parents, but the storm had knocked out the phone lines. No cell service either, typical for our area during bad weather. I was completely cut off. The knocks didn't stop, they moved. First to the back door, then the windows, always 3, always deliberate. I peeked through the curtains, but all I saw was swirling snow and darkness. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint, almost like it was inside my head. My name. Anna. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Charlie started barking wildly, his hackles raised, and then he ran to the basement door. He stood there, barking and growling like a maniac. I didn't want to go down there. I mean, who would? But Charlie wouldn't stop, so I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The basement was freezing, the kind of cold that makes your breath cloud up instantly. As I crept down the stairs, the beam of my flashlight flickered and died. Perfect, right? I stood there in the dark, feeling the kind of fear that makes your skin crawl. That's when I heard it again. Anna. This time it was louder. Closer. I scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. Charlie was still barking, but now he was at the living room window. His nose was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up. I ran to him, and that's when I saw it. A face. Pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, staring at me through the window. I screamed and stumbled backward, pulling Charlie with me. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. It smiled. A slow, eerie grin that stretched too far, showing jagged, yellow teeth. I grabbed my car keys, threw on my coat, and bolted for the back door, dragging Charlie behind me. The plan was simple: get to the car and drive to town, storm be damned. But as soon as I stepped outside, I stopped cold. The footprints were back, hundreds of them, circling the house, overlapping, crisscrossing in a chaotic pattern. And in the middle of it all, there it stood. The figure. Tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow. I couldn't see its face anymore, but I could feel it watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like forever. Then it started moving. Not walking, gliding. Silent and smooth, like it wasn't even touching the ground. It was coming toward me. I ran. I didn't even think. I just ran. Charlie barked and followed, his leash dragging behind him. The snow was so deep it felt like I was wading through quicksand. My car was buried, useless. I made it to the edge of the woods before I tripped and fell. When I looked back, it was gone. The figure, the footprints, everything. Just the blizzard, howling, and relentless. I didn't stop running until I reached old Mrs. Peterson's house a mile down the road. She let me in, wrapped me in blankets, and called the sheriff. They found nothing. No footprints, no face at the window. Nothing. But here's the thing. When I got home the next day, there were 3 perfect knocks on the door. I don't live there anymore. I can't. But every winter, I hear them. 3 knocks, always 3. And I know it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 2.
It was the dead of winter, a frigid January night when the kind of cold seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I had just moved into a small, run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, Colorado. It was cheap, almost too cheap, but I needed to get away for a while, to escape the noise, the people, and the ghosts of my past. Funny, considering what was about to happen. The cabin was old, older than it looked. The landlord mentioned something about it being a hunting lodge back in the 1800s, but I didn't pay much attention. All I cared about was the solitude. A roaring fire, thick blankets, and complete isolation sounded like heaven. I didn't realize how hellish isolation could feel until that night. The storm hit around 8 p.m. The wind howled through the trees, snow piled against the windows, and the power flickered on and off. I wasn't worried. I had stocked up on firewood, and the cabin came with an old generator. I lit a few candles, grabbed a book, and settled into the creaky armchair by the fireplace. That's when I heard it. A faint knock. Just like before, the kind of sound you can convince yourself you imagined. But then it came again, 3 deliberate taps on the front door. My heart skipped a beat. No one should have been out there. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the road was practically impassable. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the storm's relentless howl. I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The cold hit me like a slap, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the swirling snow. No one was there. I shut the door, locked it, and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It's just the wind, I told myself, just the storm playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. The knocks came again, louder this time. Not from the front door, but the back. My blood ran cold. How could someone have gotten back there so quickly? The cabin's rear door opened onto the woods, thick, dark, and impenetrable in this weather. I didn't go to the back door. Instead, I turned off the lights and peered through the kitchen window, trying to stay hidden. The flashlight beam barely reached the edge of the tree line, but for a moment I saw something. A shadow, tall and thin, just standing there, watching. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. Whoever, or whatever it wasn't leaving, and it wasn't alone. I began to hear footsteps circling the cabin, crunching through the snow, slow, deliberate, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind was carrying them, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. "You can't hide." My breath caught in my throat. The voice was raspy, unnatural. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the cabin. "You can't run." I clutched the fireplace poker, my only weapon, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Was I hallucinating? Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe I had made a mistake coming here. The whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. And then the power went out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of the fireplace. I moved closer to the fire, clutching the poker so tightly my knuckles ached. I tried to convince myself that if I just stayed by the fire, I'd be safe. Fire wards off predators, right? But then I heard it, a creak. Not from outside, but from inside the cabin. Someone, or something, was in here with me. I froze, my ears straining to pick up any sound. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something heavy, moving slowly toward me. My flashlight was still on the table by the front door, but I didn't dare move to grab it. Instead, I held my breath and waited. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence, and then the voice came again, right behind me. "Leave." I spun around, swinging the poker wildly, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. But I could feel it. Something was there. The room felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was alive and pressing down on me. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the firelight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with arms that stretched too long and eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Its head tilted to the side, as if studying me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It didn't lunge or attack. It just stared, its glowing eyes boring into mine. And then it smiled. A grotesque, unnatural grin that made my stomach churn. "Leave," it whispered again, though its mouth didn't move. The sound was in my head, echoing like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I don't remember much after that. I think I passed out. When I came to, the fire had gone out, the storm had passed, and the cabin was eerily quiet. The power was still out, but the faint light of dawn was seeping through the windows. I grabbed my keys, my coat, and whatever I could carry and got the hell out of there. The snow was deep, and it took me hours to reach the main road, but I didn't care. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. When I finally got to a diner and sat down to catch my breath, I overheard an old man talking to the waitress. He was rambling about the cabin, about how it was cursed. "They say it's the spirits of the hunters," he muttered, "the ones who never made it out of the wood. They don't take kindly to strangers." I didn't say a word. I just paid my bill and left. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove through that part of Colorado again. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear it. Leave.
Story number 3.
The winter of 2018 was the coldest I'd ever experienced. I was living in a small, remote town in Montana, where the snow never seemed to stop, and the nights felt longer than anywhere else. I was working as a caretaker for an old, abandoned lodge that sat at the edge of a frozen lake, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was supposed to be easy money, just keep the place maintained during the off-season. No one told me about the lodge's past or what still lingered there. The first few days were uneventful. The lodge was massive, its dark wood interior a maze of empty rooms and creaky hallways. During the day, sunlight bounced off the snow, making the whole place seem almost inviting. But when night fell, the lodge transformed. Shadows stretched long and deep, and every sound felt amplified in the silence. It started with the wind. The way it howled around the lodge at night didn't sound natural. It wasn't just wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like something out there was calling. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But then things began to happen. Small things at first. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be open when I returned. Lights flickering, even though the wiring was supposedly new. And then there were the footprints. One morning, I went outside to check on the generator. The snow was fresh and untouched except for one set of footprints leading from the woods to the back door of the lodge. They were large, too large to be human, and spaced too far apart, like whatever made them had an unnaturally long stride. I followed the trail into the woods, hoping to find some logical explanation. But after about 50 feet, the footprints just stopped. No sign of retreat, no sign of anything else. It was as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. That night, the knocking started. 3 sharp raps on the front door. I was upstairs in one of the guest rooms when I heard it. My stomach dropped. No one should have been out here. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and the snowstorm raging outside made it impossible for anyone to get through. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously went to the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I opened the door a crack and shone the light outside. Nothing. Just snow and darkness. I shut the door, bolted it, and tried to calm myself. But the knocking came again, louder this time. It didn't make sense. I just checked. No one was there. The sound moved as if something was circling the lodge. Knocking on the windows, the back door, even the walls. My heart raced as I followed the noise from room to room, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. Just the snow and the endless empty night. And then I heard it, a voice. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was there, whispering my name. "Jack!" I froze. The voice was coming from inside the lodge, from the kitchen. I grabbed the fire poker and crept downstairs, my flashlight beam trembling. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was open, snow blowing in across the floor. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I told myself it must have been the wind. The latch hadn't caught properly. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew I hadn't opened that door. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. They didn't just call my name. They begged, they pleaded, and sometimes they laughed. The kind of laughter that curdles your blood. By the third night, I was barely sleeping. The knocking, the whispers, the footprints, whatever it wasn't going away. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the job or the money anymore. I just wanted out. But when I tried to drive away, the truck wouldn't start. The engine groaned and sputtered, but it was no use. The storm had buried the lodge in snow, and I was trapped. That night was the worst. The lodge felt alive, pulsing with something I couldn't see. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the halls. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the walls seemed to tremble. I barricaded myself in one of the upstairs bedrooms, clutching the fire poker like it was a lifeline. The screams grew louder, more desperate, and then they stopped. The silence was worse. And then I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, climbing the stairs. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped outside the door. For a moment, there was nothing, and then the doorknob began to turn. I don't remember much after that. I think I blacked out. When I came to, it was morning. The storm had passed and sunlight streamed through the windows. The lodge was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But when I went downstairs, the back door was wide open and the footprints were back. This time, they led away from the lodge, disappearing into the woods. I didn't stick around to find out where they went. A passing snowplow cleared the road later that afternoon, and I left without looking back. I told the landlord I couldn't do the job anymore, made up some excuse about family emergencies, and got the hell out of there. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that lodge. I don't want to know. But sometimes on cold winter nights, I swear I can still hear it. The knocking, the whispers, and that voice calling my name.
Story number 4.
It was Christmas Eve, and I had agreed to house sit for my sister and her family while they were out of town visiting her in-laws. Their place was a cozy, 2-story home nestled deep in the woods of Vermont. It was picturesque during the day, snow-covered trees, the scent of pine in the air, but at night, it was a different story. The house felt isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, surrounded by an endless forest that seemed to swallow the darkness whole. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky a fiery orange fading into a deep blue. The snow had started to fall lightly, dusting the ground in a fresh, clean layer. My sister left instructions for me to keep the wood stove going, feed their cat, and make sure the pipes didn't freeze. Easy enough. I brought a couple of books, my laptop, and some leftover Christmas cookies to keep me company. I figured it'd be a quiet night. I couldn't have been more wrong. By the time I settled in, the snow had turned into a full-blown storm. The wind howled through the trees, and the house creaked as if protesting the cold. The cat, a skittish tabby named Luna, was nowhere to be found. I assumed she was hiding in one of her usual spots and didn't think much of it. Around 8 p.m., I started to hear it, a faint knocking. It was soft at first, almost rhythmic, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the glass. I paused, listening carefully. The sound was coming from the sliding glass door in the living room, the one that opened onto the back deck. I walked over, my heart pounding slightly faster than it should have. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a branch was brushing against the glass, or maybe the storm had knocked something loose. But when I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. Just the swirling snow and the dark outline of the forest beyond. I locked the door, drew the curtains tightly, and told myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I felt uneasy. There was something about that knocking, something deliberate. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on the movie I'd put on. But the knocking came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the sliding door anymore. It was coming from the front door. I froze, staring at the hallway that led to the entrance. The sound echoed through the house, 3 sharp knocks, then silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I grabbed the poker from the wood stove and approached the front door cautiously. The peephole was frosted over so I couldn't see outside. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just a crack. The freezing wind hit me instantly and the snow swirled around in a chaotic blur. But there was no one there. Just a fresh set of footprints leading from the woods to the porch. They were large, much larger than my own, and they stopped right at the door. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and backed away, my hands trembling. The footprints didn't make sense. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of anyone leaving. It was as if whoever or whatever had been at the door had simply vanished. The storm raged on outside, and the house felt colder, emptier. I kept all the lights on, every curtain drawn, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Luna still hadn't come out of hiding, and the silence was suffocating. Just as I was starting to calm down, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the wood stove. The wind outside grew louder, almost deafening, and with it came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural growl, deep and primal. It was coming from the deck. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sliding glass door. The beam wavered as I tried to steady my hand. For a moment I saw nothing, just snow piling up against the glass. But then something moved. A shadow. Tall, hunched, with elongated limbs that didn't look human. It skittered across the deck, faster than anything I'd ever seen, disappearing out of sight. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The growling stopped. replaced by another sound, scratching. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, all around me. It was as if whatever was outside was trying to get in. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and chilling, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Let me in." I froze, my mind racing. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something wrong about it. Something off. It repeated, louder this time. "Let me in." I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just clutched the fire poker and backed into the corner of the room, praying the thing would go away. The scratching stopped abruptly, and the house fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the chimney. I stared at the wood stove, dread pooling in my stomach. The footsteps stopped directly above it. I held my breath, listening. And then, with a deafening crash, the stovepipe shook violently, sending a cloud of ash into the room. I ran upstairs, locking myself in the master bedroom. I barricaded the door with the dresser and curled up in the corner, gripping the poker like it was my last line of defense. The storm outside raged on, and the house groaned under the weight of the wind. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I woke up, it was morning. The storm had passed, and sunlight streamed through the windows. Everything was eerily quiet. I slowly made my way downstairs, my heart still pounding. The house looked untouched. No sign of the shadow, the scratching, or the voice. Even the footprints outside were gone, covered by the fresh snow. I found Luna curled up in a closet, her fur bristling as I picked her up. She wouldn't stop shaking, her eyes darting toward the windows as if she could still see something I couldn't. I packed my things and left that morning, telling my sister that the storm had been too intense and I'd gone home early. I didn't tell her about the knocking, the voice, or the shadow on the deck, but every winter since then, on stormy nights, I hear it in my dreams, the growling, the scratching, and that voice whispering from the dark, "Let me in."
Story number 5.
The winter of 1995 was the coldest I'd ever known. I was living in a small, snow-choked town in Wisconsin, working the graveyard shift as a security guard at an abandoned psychiatric hospital. It was the kind of job no one really wanted, but the pay was decent, and I thought it would be easy. Sit in the lobby, patrol the empty halls, and keep an eye out for teenagers looking for a place to party. That's all it was supposed to be. The hospital was massive, 5 stories of dark, decaying rooms and endless corridors. Most of it had been shut down since the 1970s, though a few wings had remained in use until the early 90s. Rumors swirled about why it had closed. Some said it was financial issues. Others whispered about experiments gone wrong. Either way, the building had a reputation. Locals avoided it like the plague, claiming it was haunted. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least, not back then. It was around midnight when I first noticed something was off. I was sitting at the desk in the main lobby, reading a dog-eared paperback, when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. I grabbed my flashlight and walked up the grand staircase, the beam slicing through the darkness. The second floor was a maze of patient rooms, their doors hanging open like yawning mouths. The tapping grew louder as I walked, leading me toward the East Wing, a section of the hospital that had been closed off years before due to structural issues. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. "Anyone here?" No response. Just the tapping, steady and relentless. It was coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. My breath fogged in the freezing air as I approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the room was slightly ajar, the number 237 barely visible under decades of peeling paint. I pushed the door open, my flashlight revealing an empty room. No furniture, no signs of life, just cracked tiles and graffiti scrawled across the walls. But the tapping continued, louder now. It was coming from the corner of the room where an old radiator sat rusting away. I walked closer, heart pounding in my chest. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. And then, behind me, I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. "Get out!" I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I backed out of the room and bolted down the hall, not stopping until I reached the lobby. I told myself it was just my imagination. The building was old, the pipes made noise, and the wind could sound like anything in a place like this. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak, Every groan of the building made my skin crawl. When my shift finally ended at 6 a.m., I practically ran to my car. The next night, I almost called in sick, but I needed the money, so I went back. The first few hours passed without incident, but then, around 2 a.m., the lights in the lobby flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, cursing under my breath, and made my way to the basement where the breaker box was. The basement was the worst part of the hospital. Low ceilings, damp walls, and the constant sound of dripping water. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. The breaker box was at the far end of the basement, near the morgue. I tried not to think about it as I flipped the switches, restoring power to the building. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The tapping. This time it was coming from the morgue. Nope, I muttered to myself, heading for the stairs. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped. A new sound replaced it. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps, like someone dragging their feet across the wet floor. I froze, every instinct telling me to run. The footsteps grew closer, and then I saw it, a shadow moving at the edge of the flashlight beam. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs. It moved unnaturally, its head tilted at an odd angle. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking as I tried to keep the beam steady. The shadow moved closer, its outline becoming clearer. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, piercing, filled with malice. I turned and ran, the sound of its footsteps chasing me up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The building was silent again, but I knew it was still down there, waiting. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a potential threat. When my shift finally ended, I told my supervisor I was quitting. He didn't seem surprised. "That place gets to people," he said, shaking his head. "You're not the first." I never went back to the hospital, but sometimes, late at night, I dream about it. I hear the tapping, the footsteps, and that whisper, "Get out." I should have listened.
Story number 6.
The winter of 2013 was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and lingers. I was living in a tiny town in northern Minnesota, working as a delivery driver for a local grocery store. Most of my deliveries were uneventful, but there was one that I'll never forget, a delivery that changed how I saw the world, how I saw the dark. It started on a snowy Friday evening. The sun had set hours earlier, and the snowstorm was intensifying, the wind howling like a living thing. My boss handed me an order slip with a frown. "You sure you want to take this one?" he asked. "It's out by the old Peterson place." The Peterson place. Everyone in town knew the stories. It had been abandoned for decades after a family tragedy no one liked to talk about. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted. Either way, no one went near it. But the address on the slip wasn't exactly the Peterson house. It was the cabin a few miles past it. "Someone's got to do it," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I loaded the groceries into the truck and set off, the tires crunching through the fresh snow. The storm made visibility almost non-existent, but I'd grown up in these woods. I knew the roads like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. About 10 minutes into the drive, my headlights caught something in the road. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer I realized it was a person, a woman, standing in the middle of the snow-covered road. She was wearing a thin, white dress, completely inappropriate for the weather. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands, and her face was pale. Too pale. I slowed the truck and rolled down the window, the icy wind biting at my skin. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Something about her gaze made my stomach twist. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was emptiness, like she wasn't really there. "Do you need a ride?" I asked again, louder this time. Still nothing, just that blank stare. The snow was falling heavier now, and I was starting to get nervous. I couldn't just leave her there, but something in my gut told me not to get out of the truck. I honked the horn lightly, hoping to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. Instead, she tilted her head slightly like a curious animal and took a step toward the truck. That's when I noticed her feet, bare and covered in blood, leaving crimson streaks on the snow. My instincts screamed at me to drive, but I hesitated. What if she was hurt? What if she was lost? Before I could make a decision, she opened her mouth and a low, guttural sound spilled out. It wasn't a scream or a word. It was a growl, deep and animalistic, echoing in the stillness of the woods. I slammed on the gas, the tires spinning before finally catching traction. The woman didn't move, didn't even flinch as I sped past her. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and she was still standing there, her figure slowly fading into the snowstorm. I should have turned back, should have reported her to the authorities, but I convinced myself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the storm and my overactive imagination. I pressed on, the road becoming narrower and more treacherous with every mile. When I finally reached the cabin, it was nearly swallowed by the storm. The place was small and old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. A single light burned in the window, casting an eerie glow on the snow. I grabbed the groceries and trudged to the door, my boots sinking into the deep drifts. I knocked, the sound muffled by the howling wind. A moment later, the door creaked open and an old man peered out. His face was weathered, his eyes sunken and tired. "You the delivery boy?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I said, handing him the bags. "You sure picked a hell of a night for groceries." He didn't laugh. He just stared at me for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in. It's cold." I hesitated. Something about the cabin felt off. The air was heavy, the kind of heavy that presses on your chest. But the storm was brutal, and I didn't want to be rude, so I stepped inside. The place was sparse, with only a wood stove, a small table, and a single chair. The light I'd seen from outside came from an oil lamp on the table, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Long drive out here," the old man said, setting the groceries on the counter. "You see anything on the way?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" His gaze shifted to the window, his expression unreadable. "A woman." My stomach dropped. "Yeah," I said slowly. "Standing in the road. Do you know her?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head, his shoulders sagging as if under some invisible weight. "You need to leave," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" I asked, confused. "But the storm." "Now," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. "You need to leave. Don't look back." Something in his tone sent a chill through me, colder than the winter air outside. I didn't argue. I stepped back into the storm, pulling my coat tighter around me. As I got into the truck, I glanced back at the cabin. The old man was standing in the doorway, watching me, his figure almost swallowed by the swirling snow. I started the truck and pulled away, the tires struggling against the icy road. The storm was relentless, the wind screaming like a banshee. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. And then I saw her again. She was standing on the side of the road this time, her dress billowing in the wind, her eyes fixed on me as I passed. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. But in the rearview mirror, I saw her step onto the road, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the storm. When I finally made it back to town, I told my boss everything. He listened silently, his face pale. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said, "and you won't be the last." I never went back to that cabin, never drove that route again. But every winter, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls through the trees, I think of her, the woman in white, waiting in the storm, and I wonder if she's still out there.
Story number 7.
The winter of 2010 was brutal, with endless snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures. I had just moved to a small town in Montana to start over after a rough divorce. I thought the quiet isolation of the mountains would help me heal. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. It seemed idyllic at first. Snow-covered pines, a crackling fireplace, and nothing but the sound of the wind to keep me company. But it didn't take long for me to realize I wasn't alone. The first strange occurrence happened about a week after I moved in. It was late, close to midnight, and I was sitting by the fire reading. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling like a wild animal. Then, through the noise, I heard it, a knock at the door. It was soft but deliberate, 3 sharp raps that cut through the night. I froze. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of a storm? I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing, just darkness and swirling snow. I opened the door a crack, the icy wind biting at my face, and shone the flashlight outside. The porch was empty. There were no footprints in the snow leading to or from the cabin. I shut the door and locked it, my heart pounding. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. I went back to the fire, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I decided to put the incident behind me. But as I stepped outside to gather firewood, I noticed something odd. In the snow around the cabin were strange tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. too big to be a coyote, too small to be a bear. The prints were elongated with claw-like marks at the tips, as if whatever made them had talons instead of toes. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they disappeared into the dense forest. Uneasy but unwilling to let my imagination get the best of me, I went about my day. That night, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I stayed in my chair, clutching the flashlight, my knuckles white. I didn't move. The knocking stopped after a few moments, but then came a new sound, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across the wood of the cabin. I wanted to believe it was a tree branch blown by the wind, but the sound moved. It circled the cabin, scraping along the walls, the windows, the door. It was deliberate. Something was out there. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, the shotgun I'd brought for protection resting on my lap. The noises stopped just before dawn, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The next morning, I found more tracks around the cabin. This time they were closer, right up against the walls, and there was something else. Scratched into the wood of the front door was a symbol. It was crude but unmistakable, a circle with an X slashed through it. I'd never seen anything like it, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I drove into town that day, desperate for answers. I went to the local diner and struck up a conversation with an older man named Harold. He'd lived in the area his whole life, and if anyone knew about strange happenings in the woods, it would be him. When I described the tracks and the symbol, his face grew pale. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low. "Pack up and go. Now." "What is it?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "Something's been in these woods for as long as anyone can remember," he said. "No one knows what it is, but it's old, and it's dangerous. It doesn't like strangers." I tried to press him for more details, but he shook his head and refused to say anything else. I should have listened to him. I should have left that day, but I told myself it was just superstition, small-town folklore meant to scare outsiders. I went back to the cabin, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. That night, the knocking didn't come, nor did the scraping. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, around 3 a.m., I woke to a new sound. It was faint at first, a soft humming, but it grew louder, filling the cabin with a low, droning tone that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the walls. It surrounded me, closing in, suffocating. I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun, my hands trembling, and crept into the living room. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. And then I saw it, a figure standing just outside the window. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. Its face was wrong, stretched and featureless, like a mask. It didn't move. It just stared at me, its head tilting slightly, as if studying me. I raised the shotgun, my finger on the trigger, but before I could fire, it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving nothing but the reflection of the firelight in the window. I didn't wait for morning. I threw what I could into my truck and left, driving as fast as the icy roads would allow. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even stop to collect the rest of my things. Whatever I disturbed, it didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to argue. I moved to a new town, far away from the woods, but I still can't shake the feeling that it's watching me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint knocking at my door. I never answer.
Story number 8.
It was Christmas Eve 2008 when I learned the true meaning of fear. I was a junior at college and decided to spend the holiday with my family in Vermont. My parents had rented a small cabin deep in the woods for the week, a picturesque getaway with snow-covered trees and a crackling fireplace. It was supposed to be peaceful. It wasn't. The trouble began just after dinner. We were all sitting around the fire. My mom, dad, my younger sister, Claire, and me. Snow was falling heavily outside, the wind rattling the windows. It was cozy inside, and we were trading stories when Claire pointed at the window. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "See what?" my dad replied, glancing over. "There was someone outside," she said, her face pale. We all turned to the window, but there was nothing, just the reflection of the firelight against the glass. My dad reassured her it was just her imagination, maybe the shadow of a branch swaying in the wind. But Claire wasn't convinced, and to be honest, neither was I. After dinner, we decided to play a board game to distract ourselves. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The atmosphere felt off. The warmth of the cabin suddenly seemed stifling, the shadows cast by the fire too long, too dark. Around 10 p.m., Claire got up to grab her phone from her room. She was gone for longer than expected, and when she came back, her face was pale. "Did one of you leave this?" she asked, holding up a small, folded piece of paper. We all shook our heads. "What is it?" my mom asked. Claire opened the paper, her hands trembling. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 3 words: "I see you." A chill ran down my spine. My dad jumped up, grabbed the note, and stormed outside, flashlight in hand. "Probably some prankster," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He circled the cabin, his flashlight beam cutting through the falling snow. When he came back, his face was grim. "No footprints," he said, shutting the door firmly behind him. "The snow's untouched. That should have been impossible. If someone had left that note, they would have left tracks." The snow was fresh, falling heavily all evening, but there were none. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was probably left earlier and we just hadn't noticed it. But the mood had shifted. My mom suggested we call it a night. Reluctantly, we all agreed. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, one for my parents, one for Claire, and a small one for me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the events of the evening. The figure Claire thought she saw, the note with no footprints. Something wasn't adding up. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the window in my room. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. At first, I saw nothing but snow falling gently against the glass. But then, faintly, I saw it. A face. It was pressed against the window, its features distorted by the frost. The eyes were too large, the mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I froze, unable to look away. The thing tilted its head as if curious, and then it raised one skeletal hand and tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I don't know how long I stared, paralyzed with fear. When I finally regained control of my body, I bolted out of the room and into the living area. Claire and my parents were already there, their faces pale and drawn. "You saw it too," Claire whispered, and it wasn't a question. We locked all the doors and windows, my dad grabbing the fire poker for protection. The thing outside wasn't trying to get in, though. It just wanted us to know it was there. The rest of the night passed in terrified silence. The tapping moved from room to room, as if it were circling the cabin, testing us. None of us dared to sleep. By dawn, the tapping stopped, and the snow had covered any trace of its presence. We left that morning, cutting our vacation short. None of us wanted to talk about what happened, and when we got home, we tried to pretend it was all a bad dream. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't a dream. A week later, I got a text from Claire. It was just a single photo, a piece of paper folded in half. On it, in jagged handwriting, were the words, "Still watching."
Story number 9.
I never should have agreed to house sit for the Braxton family. It seemed like an easy gig at the time. A long weekend in their massive, isolated house up in the Colorado mountains. They were old family friends, and when they mentioned they needed someone to watch the place and feed their 2 cats while they went on a ski trip, I jumped at the chance. A free place to stay, cozying up by the fire in the middle of a picturesque winter. What could go wrong? The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, watched TV, and eventually went to bed in the guest room. The house creaked in the wind, but that's normal for a place as old as theirs. It was quiet, almost too quiet. But I convinced myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far from civilization. The second night was when things started to feel off. Around 11 p.m., I was lying on the couch in the living room, flipping through channels, when I heard the sound of a door creaking open upstairs. I froze. The Braxtons had said no one would be around, and I'd locked every door and window before settling in for the night. I turned off the TV and strained my ears, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind howling outside. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest. The cats were accounted for. They were curled up on the chair by the fire, both wide awake and staring at the ceiling. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The noise grew louder as I reached the top. A slow, deliberate scraping sound that made my stomach churn. The hallway was empty, but at the far end, the door to the master bedroom was ajar. That's when I saw it, the edge of something dark peeking out from behind the door. It was low to the ground, and whatever it was moving. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. The movement stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt deafening. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a step forward. The flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it toward the door. When I reached it, I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. The scraping sound started again, this time behind me. I whipped around, shining the light down the hallway, but there was nothing there. My breathing was ragged, my skin cold with sweat. I backed into the bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight and listening to the sounds outside the door, scraping, whispering, the faintest hint of laughter. It didn't stop until dawn. The next morning, I considered leaving, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was the wind or the old house settling. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. I spent the day exploring the house, trying to shake the unease. That's when I found the door. It was in the basement, tucked behind some shelves. It didn't lead anywhere, just a small, square wooden door about 3 feet tall with an iron latch. It was odd, out of place, and I couldn't resist opening it. The hinges groaned as I pulled it open, revealing a dark tunnel that extended far beyond the house. A foul, earthy smell wafted out, and I gagged, stepping back. That's when I saw them. Scratches on the inside of the door. Deep, jagged grooves that looked like they'd been made by claws. I slammed the door shut and ran upstairs, my pulse racing. Something was wrong with this house. Something had been inside. That night, I barricaded myself in the guest room, piling furniture in front of the door. I turned on every light in the room and sat on the bed, shotgun in hand. The Braxtons had left it in a locked cabinet in case of wildlife, and I wasn't taking any chances. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just the scraping. There were footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, moving up and down the hallway. Then came the whispering, faint and guttural, like voices speaking a language I didn't understand. The lights flickered. I held my breath, gripping the shotgun tightly. Then the voices stopped. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then something slammed against the door. I screamed, backing against the wall. The door rattled on its hinges as whatever was on the other side threw itself against it again and again. The furniture I'd piled up began to shift, and I could see the doorknob twisting violently. I fired the shotgun at the door, the sound deafening in the small room. The banging stopped, my ears rang, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside the door. Slowly, the doorknob began to twist again. I grabbed my phone and called 911. My voice was shaking as I told the dispatcher someone was in the house. I didn't mention the whispers or the growling. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? The banging resumed, harder this time. The dispatcher stayed on the line, assuring me officers were on their way, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was trying to get in wasn't human. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The banging, the growling, the whispers, all of it. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. I stayed on the line until I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police searched the house but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow outside. The basement door, the one I'd opened earlier, was gone, just a blank wall where it had been. I didn't wait for the Braxtons to return. I packed my things and left, ignoring their calls and messages. I never told them what happened, and I've never been back. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear faint whispers and the sound of scraping outside my bedroom door. I keep the shotgun close, but deep down I know it won't help.